discuss common GHS conversion mistakes to avoid. My name is Amanda Yerke, and I'll be your host for the next hour. To get started, I'm going to share a little bit about quantum compliance. For the past 30 years, quantum has been helping corporations increase productivity using information technology to comply with regulations. Quantum focuses on developing commercial information management tools for environmental health and safety experts. We provide extensive professional support services, including consulting, training, data entry, software maintenance, implementation, and software customization. The extensive industry experience of Quantum's employees is one of the keys to our success. Here at Quantum, we're determined to help you protect your employees' health and safety in the workplace, reduce your risk to exposure associated with noncompliance, improve the efficiency of your current environmental health and safety information management processes, and shift your focus from compliance to sustainability and corporate social responsibility. Before I introduce our first presenter, I'd like to address a few organizational items. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We will leave time at the end of the webinar to address all of your inquiries. Please note that the session is being recorded. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with the link to this recording. Feel free to share the information with your coworkers and your clients, as it may be beneficial to them as well. Without further ado, I'm excited to announce our first panelist, Nikki Burgess. Nikki has been a regulatory specialist at Label Master since November of 2010. Nikki provides dangerous goods, hazard communication, environmental safety and health, and hazardous waste regulatory assistance, product support, and training to Label Master employees and customers worldwide. She draws on over 25 years of experience in the field, and her professional certifications as both a dangerous goods safety advisor and a certified dangerous goods professional, twin certifications in the industry presently held by less than 100 individuals. Nikki is one of Label Master's primary experts on hazard communication and serves as one of 2 designated specialists dealing with the implementation of the globally harmonized system into the U.S. OSHA hazard communication system. Nikki was also recently trained as a specialist in the loading, unloading of rail tank cars with crude oil, graduating in the first ever class to certify in this newly critical skill set. Nikki writes extensively for the transportation, logistics, chemical, and manufacturing industries, with her work appearing in numerous professional and mass market venues dealing with the subject matter. So at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Nikki.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. And first of all, I'd like to thank our host, Amanda at Quantum, for asking Label Master to come aboard and participate in this webinar. We certainly appreciate the opportunity. What Quantum asked Label Master to provide to you guys today is basically a primer on the GHS and some reasons why it's so important and how we got to where we are today. So first of all, what we're going to do is look at a little bit of history. Back in the early 1970s, OSHA was established, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It was established here in the United States. And basically, it was put in place in order to sort of establish a conglomerate for having safety rules, whereas previous to OSHA, state organizations sort of ran their own game. There was a lot of differences from state to state. OSHA established kind of a harmonized balance between them. In 1983, OSHA came out with the initial promulgation of the Hazard Communication Rule, the 29 CFR 1910.1200. The 29 CFR 1910.1200 is still the rule we operate under today. However, the language has changed to incorporate the GHS, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Then in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, the United Nations set up a conference with the goal of having a globally harmonized system of hazard communication in the transportation of the workplace by the year 2000. The UN and participating countries did a very good job of harmonizing the transportation criteria fairly rapidly, and that's been in place now for a long time. The hazard communication in the workplace portion, which is what we're talking about today, has taken quite a bit longer. As you know, it's now 2015, and in many ways, here in the United States, the rule is just coming aboard. So what is the GHS? The globally harmonized system is a joint global framework of guidelines for classifying and communicating chemical hazards. It was created under the United Nations, and it's updated as conditions of knowledge change. Currently, it's in its 5th revision, called Rev 5. However, the OSHA rule, the 1910-1200, is based on the 3rd revision. The technical differences between the 3rd and the 5th revisions are minor. Right now, implementation is proceeding rapidly worldwide. GHS itself is not a law, a regulation, or a legal standard, nor is it even an industry best practice. Rather, it's an agreed framework which countries, groups, and other interested or affected bodies can use to create harmonized versions of the above. So basically, what it means is that with any of the United Nations regulations, whether it's the model regulations for the transport of dangerous goods, the safety of life at sea agreements, or anything else, those are all called model regulations. Basically, as many countries as possible get together and they agree on a framework that they can use to create their own bodies of law. The goal is for each body of law to be as similar to each other as possible so that the transport of goods and people across state boundaries, and by state we're talking about nations, is as seamless as possible, and so that people on one side of the world can understand what people on the other side of the world are talking about as easily as possible. So let's talk a little bit about hazard communication here in the United States. Here it affects more than 40 million employees. It impacts over 5 million U.S. workplaces. And it provides hazard communication guidelines related to nearly 900,000 chemicals. Essentially, the guideline is if you have one employee using one chemical, you're included under the law. Pretty much only self-employed people under specific circumstances are excluded. It's governed by the United States Department of Labor, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which everybody calls OSHA. Who's affected by these changes? Chemical manufacturers and distributors are kind of the first ones that are going to be affected. Chemical producers have to classify their products and provide the appropriate hazard warning labeling and safety data sheets, or SDSs, for each substance they produce. And that information has to be provided to downstream users and shippers. Distributors and importers also have to distribute to the same set of downstream customers. Now, there's been a hazard communication standard in place here in the United States since 1983. Most people listening to this broadcast are probably fairly familiar with it, using things like NFPA diamonds, HMIS labels, things like that. And so here at Label Master, we've taken a lot of questions about exactly why this is going on. Here are some benefits. The full global implementation will make hazard communication systems understandable worldwide. The idea is that if one produces a product here in the United States and wishes to export it to another country, with a globally harmonized system of hazard communication, when your product gets to the country you're shipping to, the goal is to have the workers in that country be able to understand the hazards of the product right away. And of course, the same applies to any product that is being shipped here in the United States from across the world. It will ease the burden of hazard communication for global trade. It might help remove some of the technical barriers that some countries do occasionally use to limit such activity. Sometimes one of our products gets to a dock somewhere else in the world, and there's some sort of local law or regulation in place that is used to kind of limit the ability of U.S. companies to trade effectively. And of course, that's not good for us, especially over the long term. So the GHS implementation is designed to try to address that. It should also allow workers to change jobs and still maintain familiarity with the basic global system. So, how'd we get here? Well, in March of 2012, OSHA acted. The new hazard communication standard, which remember uses the same numbers, the 29 CFR 1910.1200. It was promulgated as a final rule in the Federal Register. It became effective on May 25, 2012. The GHS standard is now in place in the United States. In Canada, actually just within the last couple of weeks, Canada finally officially published in what they call their Gazette, the Canada Gazette, which is the equivalent in Canada of the U.S. Federal Register, their GHS implementation. Most of their deadlines are going to be in the year 2017, which of course is a little later than ours. But now Mexico, the United States, and Canada, all three North American countries, have embraced the GHS legally. Of course, the initial deadline that we faced for having your employees trained to understand and use the system passed back in December of 2013. So if anybody is listening to this broadcast and has not trained their employees yet, that is something that OSHA is already busy enforcing. So you're going to want to try to attend to that absolutely as soon as possible. So here's some things that the revised standard does. It keeps most basic elements of the previous hazard communication standard in place. That is, it requires things like training your employees, notifying your employees about the presence of hazardous materials in their workplace, keeping the accurate chemical inventory, properly labeling containers which are used in the workplace, and having the appropriate documentation. All of those things were spelled out in the initial 1910.1200, and they remain there today. It increases worker protection via the use of enhanced requirements for hazard communication labels on both shipped and secondary use containers, as well as much more comprehensively constructed safety data sheets. It's very probable that everybody listening is familiar with the term MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet. Well, under this new standard, we're going to be shifting to the new Safety Data Sheet format, which luckily for people in the United States is based pretty much on the US MSDS format, with some additions and changes. But it won't be very hard to understand at all. It does require a much more comprehensive effort to classify and identify the risk of chemicals. This is deliberate because one of the flaws, if you will, of the old system is how general it was. And it was designed to be general in order to be easy to use. However, this new system is designed to have very much enhanced protections for workers. And in order to do that, it has to provide a lot more information. It changes the how of things. It mandates very specific and enhanced labeling, as well as, again, the conversion of the MSDS system to the new GHS format, which has a 16-section safety data sheet, or SDS. Again, it uses the UN's GHS Revision 3, not the current Revision 5, as its baseline. That will be one thing to keep in mind as you go through this. If you want to consult the GHS book itself, what's called the Purple Book, in relation to our own hazard communication standard, you want to be sure you're looking at the correct revision so that you understand that if there's a difference between the most current revision of the GHS and the third revision, you understand which section OSHA has decided to use, at least at present. We'll talk very briefly about labeling. The GHS labeling very largely reflects usage by the US DOT, ICAO, and IMO transport world. That, of course, is the U.S. Department of Transportation, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the International Maritime Organization. Many of you are probably familiar with the very comprehensive regulations in place for transporting dangerous goods. Well, the GHS system is in some ways set up deliberately to be very similar to that. It uses internationally recognized pictograms, many of which are, again, very similar to what are in use in the transport world. That is designed to limit the need for language conversion from country to country. The idea is that, if nothing else, workers all over the world will be able to see the pictograms in place on the labeling and get at least a basic idea about the hazards present in the material. These labels have to be based on and conform to the information on the SDS. And that is why properly and correctly constructing your safety data sheet in the first place is so important. So, the gorilla in the room. The biggest change to the hazard communication standard is a requirement to carry out chemical classification as it's found in the UN GHS and as it's incorporated in our own hazard communication standard. It eliminates any wiggle room. This, in large part, will also form the basis for the SDS construction. What's important to understand is that under the previous standard, Essentially, you were required to evaluate risk and try to propagate the risk that you thought existed with the product. Under the new system, that's not really any longer the case. Now you have to formally classify the product, and based on the classification that you assign to it, under the standards which are in the rule, those standards of classification will then guide you to the directed hazard assumptions that OSHA intends for you to make about the product. It's a big change. That is probably the most monumental change that exists. And again, it's why having a correct SDS is so important, because everything's going to flow from that. So the safety data sheet, we'll talk here at Label Master very briefly about it. The new standard converts the current system of MSDSs over to the new SDS. There are 16 sections which are harmonized with international requirements, and they serve as the basis for correct label creation. And the SDSs are going to require having significantly more information about things like the use of the product, its storage, disposal, and many other vital subjects. Okay, the 29 CFR 1910.1200 defines safety data sheets this way. Safety data sheets, SDSs, are written or printed material concerning a hazardous chemical, that is prepared in accordance with paragraph G of this section. Paragraph G is a reference to the regulation itself. Basically what it says is, it defines the rules and formats which are going to be used to construct those safety data sheets. It also delineates the requirements under which the SDSs are to be made available for use and or inspection. So, at this point in time, I'd like to give it back to the technical experts who can assist you with constructing your own body of safety data sheets as you may require. And that's Quantum, our partner. And so I'll turn it now back over to Amanda for the rest of the presentation. Amanda?
Thank you, Nikki. Now we're going to hear from Steve Russie, who will discuss specific differences between the existing MSDSs and the revised GHS compliant SDSs. Steve is the Director of Product Development at Quantum Compliance. In his 25th year with the company, Steve has continued to contribute to the design and implementation of all of Quantum's products. Steve is currently Quantum's in-house GHS expert. With over 11 years of experience in GHS regulations, Steve's expertise is built on a foundation of industry information. Steve has orchestrated the implementation of a global SDS generation and delivery system. This project included implementing software across 6 continents in 35 languages based on a tight integration with the client's ERP system. Steve's wealth of knowledge and experience has enabled him to help clients navigate the complicated pathway to GHS compliance. Steve?
Thanks, Amanda. I'd like to first touch on the GHS timelines. Basically, some of them have already passed. You should already have all of your employees trained as to what the new GHS labels and SDS look like and how to use them. The one that everyone's worried about right now is the June 1st deadline, which is for anyone who manufactures the chemicals. The labels must be labels and the labels and the SDS must be in GHS format by June 1st. This is true for anyone manufacturing chemicals. Anyone who's a distributor, anyone who's got a warehouse, all of the stock in your warehouse must be labeled with the proper GHS labels by December 1st. Now these are deadlines that are in there put in by OSHA, but we've already heard rumors from quite a few of our clients that some of their major customers are demanding that they be in compliance by May 1st. So you may not have as much time as you want. So if you haven't already got your GHS plan in full gear, you might want to get on that. So the final deadline is June 1st of next year, which is the deadline where all workplace labels and SDS must be in the GHS format. The main difference between the old, if you're looking just at the SDS, the main difference between the old format, the old 16-section format, and the new GHS format is in Section 2 and 3. Section 2 is made up of Section 2.1, which is the classification. So this is the overall GHS classification of the product. There's 28 GHS classifications, and you have to evaluate your products according to each one. Most of them are going to be pretty simple. You know if your product's an explosive or not, so you don't have to think too hard about some of them. Others are a little more hard to just exclude right away. So the Section 2.1 is the overall classification of your SDS. Section 2.2 are the label elements of the SDS. Now these include basically a reiteration of what's in Section 2.1, but also any pictograms that are required, and a signal word, danger or warning. So depending on the severity of the GHS classification, you'll either see a danger or a warning. Under that are what we call the H phrases or hazard phrases, and then the precautionary phrases, the P phrases. Those break down into 4 different types: prevention, response, storage, and disposal. So all of this information is required on the label, along with the information that was previously required, such as your product identifier and your company information, your name and address, contact phone number, and so on and so forth. The other major change that you'll see is in Section 3. You are now required on Section 3 to disclose the GHS classification of each of the ingredients within your product. Now this one is often very confusing to people, because when we do an SDS conversion for someone, they'll see quite a few GHS classifications on Section 3 that aren't appropriate for the entire product. But what this is are the classifications for the individual ingredients as if they were in there at 100%. So for example, here we've got toluene, which is an aspiration tox 1, and it's STOT, which is specific target organ. Those might be below the threshold to trigger the product as a whole, but on Section 3 you need to classify, you need to specify what they are. And this is really nice if you're the consumer of a GHS and SDS. If you're the one who gets this, you should be able to use this information and the physical properties to basically reverse engineer the classifications in Section 2.1. So it should all make sense if you look at this and that and know what the Purple Book says. Those are the basic changes that you'll see. The rest of the SDS, Sections 4 through 16, pretty much like they have been in the ANSI Standard 16 section. Quite a few of the SDS you're used to seeing did not really fulfill that, so you see an awful lot of 9-section SDSs and SDSs that don't have a bunch of data in the other sections. But now they are, for the most part, required. Now OSHA does not mandate what sort of data you put in there quite as much as some of the other legislations do, and they have deferred things such as the transportation and the environmental hazards to OSHA and DOT, because those are the organizations that handle those, but they still should be on a proper SDS.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Now I'll turn it over to Jessica Vachon, who will answer some of the most common GHS conversion questions that we have. Jessica is one of Quantum Compliance's project coordinators. She has been with Quantum since 2014 and works with SDS authoring, conversion, and software implementation. Prior to joining the Quantum team, Jessica worked in the chemical manufacturing industry as a quality manager and analytical chemist. With this technical background, she brings insight from the industry as well as an in-depth knowledge of chemicals and their hazards.
Thanks, Amanda. So let's go over some common questions that we receive regarding GHS conversion. So many people want to know what materials need to be included in a GHS compliant SDS. And the answer to that one is all materials that have a physical, health, or environmental hazard. There are a couple manufacturers that do consumer products, and they want to know, do they need an SDS? Materials such as pharmaceuticals, food additives, cosmetics, food and pesticide residues in food do not require an SDS when they're sold directly for consumption. So these materials, you do not need to provide an SDS to your consumers, but at different points during that life cycle, you may need to provide an SDS. A good example of this one is if you're a paint manufacturer and you're selling paint cans to a hardware store. Your end users, the consumers, do not need an SDS, but the hardware store itself may require you to provide an SDS for their workers, so their workers understand the hazards of all of the materials that they'll be handling in the store that they may come in contact with. Another great question is, what regulatory reports should be included in your OSHA-compliant GHS SDS? And the answer to that one is it's not really regulated which ones are mandatory in your Section 15, which is the regulatory section, but there are a lot of reports, regulatory reports, that people will be looking for. So, for example, California, the Prop 65, your New Jersey and Pennsylvania Right to Know list, the EPRA list, 311, 312, 302, and 313, which include your extremely hazardous and toxic chemicals and what should be reported to the EPA. A lot of people are looking for those types of information down in Section 15. You're also going to want to include your Toxic Substance Control Act and the United States EPA Tier 2 hazards. Another question is, do we have different SDSs for each country that you're shipping to internationally? And this one, many of the different countries have adopted different sections of the GHS, have adopted different versions, and will require different regulatory information in the final SDS. So the answer is yes, you do have to have a different one for each country that you're shipping to. For example, the U.S. has adopted the 2012, whereas the European Chemical, the EU, they're constantly updating the Purple Book, and they're adopting new versions of the Purple Book, and they're requiring different regulatory things and different information to be on their documents. Are there any resources for GHS compliant SDS or label templates? In short, no. There are no templates that you can use because blends of chemicals result in different chemical classifications. So a template would be insufficient. There is a basic template for the SDS, which is a 16-section. Each section is regulated with what information needs to be in it. Each section has to have, Section 1, for example, has to be your identifier. Section 2 has to have your hazards and your labeling information. So each section is written out what needs to be included, but that's as far as the template goes. You can't just choose a template and plug your chemicals in because that will be insufficient. There are a lot of software packages that use rule-based algorithms, and these are very reliable alternatives to templates. So reporting your hazardous materials, what are your percentage cutoffs? Some hazards require reporting in quantities as low as 0.1%. So I always recommend that you report everything. You give all of the information that you have, even if it's a very low percentage, because some of those materials may be classified as skin sensitizers, carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins, and those are required to be on your SDSs as low as 0.1%. So are there any requirements for language translation? SDSs should be translated into the language of the country that they're being delivered to. So if you're shipping products to China and you are looking to be GHS compliant, you need to ship those products with your SDS translated into simplified Chinese. A big question that we get on a regular basis is how to map proprietary data. And this one, you can do multiple different things to map your proprietary data. The biggest one that we see is you can take your formula and provide a range for each ingredient, a percentage range. And this allows you to mask not only the percentage of each ingredient, but your overall formula. If you would like to mask a particular CAS number so that you can keep particular ingredients in your formulas proprietary, you can use proprietary for your CAS number. You have to have a generic product class name, such as surfactant blend, and you must report all hazard classes in that ingredient. I'm going to hand this back over to Amanda.
Thanks, Jessica. So now we're going to enter the portion of the webinar where we address all of our questions from the attendees. Some of these were submitted before the webinar started, but we're also getting a great deal of questions as we continue on. So I'll start off with a labeling question. This one's for you, Nikki. Is there a minimum container size which requires labeling?
No, and that's a great question because there's been a lot of curiosity about that, especially as regards containers which contain a multiple of different vials or bottles, things like test kits and sample kits. And at least as of right now, today, OSHA has not really allowed any slack in terms of having to individually identify and label each of those. There was a lot of interpretation in December of 2013 which addresses that. It was not very accommodating to the requester, so at least as of today, it's pretty much a case of regardless of the size of the container, if it fits into the parameters which require labeling based on its contents, then you're going to have to figure out a way to label it.
Great, thank you. This one's for you, Steve. My formulas are trade secrets. Do I have to disclose all of my ingredients?
Well, that actually, Jessica touched on that a bit in the last couple slides. You do need to disclose all of the hazards associated with your product. So you may choose to not disclose the actual CAS number and exact percent, but you are required to disclose exactly what the hazards are and any information you know. So I would suggest that if you have any exposure data, TLV data, that sort of thing, or any LD50 data, any lethal dose data, any of that, it should be on the SDS and specific to that ingredient.
Okay, great. This is another one for you, Steve. What about pharmaceuticals that only get administered in hospital settings and are not sold over the counter, not even by prescription? These are not technically sold directly to consumers. They are instead administered to patients by doctors, nurses in a control setting.
So the FDA actually, I believe, controls the labeling for pharmaceuticals. You are not required by OSHA to create an SDS for pharmaceuticals and a few other classes of chemicals that Jessica mentioned earlier, alluded to earlier. But we've had quite a few pharmaceutical companies actually come to us for SDS conversion because it's just to be like all of the other chemicals that are on hand even in a hospital setting. It's nice to have everything labeled in a similar manner. So several of the people who are doing pharmaceuticals or things of that nature are also going through the effort of changing their labeling and creating GHS compliant SDSs, even though it's not technically required by the OSHA standard.
Great, thanks. This one's for you, Nikki. How are the pictograms captured and installed on SDSs and labels? Are they implemented using JPEG files, and where are those available?
Well, the answer is that they're, it really depends on how you want to do it. Now, for instance, here at Label Master, we offer services in which you can basically custom design a label, and we can make it up for you. You can identify the elements and text you want on it, and we can print it out in any size, color, and quantity you'd like. If you're more interested in simply a do-it-yourself approach, pretty much most of that stuff you can find online through Google searches, and then how you transfer it into a document is really kind of up to you. But you have to make sure that when you do things like that, you still have to abide by the guidelines that are set out in the rule in terms of the correct color, the correct identification of the pictogram. It has to look right. And there's a lot of stuff floating around on the internet that purports to be correct, and it may not be. So if you choose a more do-it-yourself approach like that, you should be very cautious. You should have a copy of the rule sitting there with you so that you can very closely compare what you intend to use with what is actually required.
That's great. Thank you. Here's another one for you, Nikki. How is GHS labeling of small vials of pharmaceutical drugs accomplished when the vial label is taken or dictated by FDA information? There's not much space available on a drug vial label to add even more information, and it's already regulated by the FDA.
Well, as Steve mentioned, FDA-controlled products are not covered under the hazard communication standard. If everybody takes a look, if you look at 29 CFR 1910.1200, subsection B, called Scope and Applications, and what, among other things, what is in there is what is not covered, and there's a wide variety of things that are excluded. FDA-controlled items, stuff that's included by the Agriculture Department, some pesticides. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So the first thing you want to do with your product before you start investing the time and effort to engage the HCS system is just take a few minutes to look at the scope and application and verify that your product is actually, going to be covered under it, and that, you need to go through the effort. Now, if you do go through the effort, you find out that you are covered, but you have a tiny little vial, I would strongly recommend that you go ahead and take a look at that letter of interpretation. It came out last December. It was addressed from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. NIST went to OSHA and they asked a bunch of questions about labeling very small containers, because this deals with a bunch of test kits where there's tiny little vials of chemicals inside them. NIST went to OSHA and said, well, look, we have this problem. We've got a bunch of tiny little containers, that they are not of a size that will bear labeling with any ease. NIST went ahead and proposed several different possible solutions. OSHA was not amenable to any of them. The only thing OSHA decided to allow was a slightly modified label format, which still includes most of the required format elements on it anyway, and then references another document which has the rest of the information. It was very little relief, and that is a sticking point which is becoming more and more evident as the implementation goes forward. Now, whether or not OSHA is going to address that further, no one could say. I know through our contacts here in industry, a lot of industry groups are approaching OSHA about the practicality of their current stance. However, at least as of today, boots on the ground, nothing has changed. So ways that you can address that are, one big way that people are doing this is through the use of fold-out type labels, where the label attaches at a very minimal point to the vial or the container, and then the label proceeds to fold out, so that at least it's of a smaller size for packing. You could also attach via tags and so on and so forth. But I wish I had better news for people in terms of, oh, well, OSHA decided that was, poorly thought out and they're going to change their mind. But that has not, as of yet, been the case. So you're just kind of stuck having to deal with it. But if you have very small containers, I think it would be of great interest to you to go on the OSHA website to look at the interpretations that are relevant to this rule, and to dig up that one from December of 2013 between OSHA and NIST, because that is directly relevant to your situation. And so that would be a strong recommendation on my part to take a look at that.
That sounds great. Thanks, Nikki. This next question is for Steve. The client is wondering if SDSs are used for hazardous chemicals. What are the regulations say when a chemical is considered non-hazardous? Additionally, where can you find the 20 GHS hazardous categories?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. The 28 GHS categories are straight out of the UN Purple Book, which is basically the guideline for how all the classifications are done. They basically break down into physical hazards, chemical hazards, physical hazards, environmental hazards, and health hazards. Sorry, stumbling on the health hazards. And the physical hazards are such things as flammability, flammable solid, flammable liquid, flammable aerosol, explosive, pyrophoric, things of that nature. The health hazards are eye and skin corrosion, acute toxicity, carcinogen, mutagen, things of that nature. And then the environmental hazards are the aquatic toxicity and hazard to the ozone layer, both of which OSHA does not mandate. The first part of that question is, what do I do, I believe, if I've got non-hazardous chemical? Many of the SDSs that we see are not hazardous enough to trigger any of the GHS classifications, but they do contain chemicals that are hazardous. Good example of that might be something that is a mineral oil that has a TLV, or a nuisance dust that has a TLV, but nothing in it is particularly toxic or corrosive or whatnot. And in that case, I think you're still required to create an SDS, since there are hazards involved with the chemicals. Now, labeling that, and Nikki and I have discussed this earlier, there's no requirement to label with the GHS label if there are no GHS classifications triggered. So, Nikki, would you mind giving your 2 cents on that?
Well, again, I would say the important thing is to take a look at scope and applications and verify whether or not your product is covered, under the rule. And, if there is a requirement to create an SDS, is there a requirement to label or not? A lot of times that's going to depend on the intended use of the container. If it's a consumer product, which a lot of times things that fall into this area tend to be, then it depends on whether its use is going to be domestic. In other words, a typical person is using it in his or her home or garage or whatever to clean or to fit paint or whatever the case may be, as opposed to, the very same product in the very same container being taken to a place of business and being used by an employee in a way to support the actual workplace. What I would say is this, is that, and we're running into this a lot because obviously this is a major topic of interest right now. If you look at the HCS and your product is not covered under it, and you decide to proceed anyway, do not fall into the trap of saying, well, I'm not really covered, so I'm just going to cherry pick the elements of the rule that I like or that are convenient or that I can easily do. Okay, it does not work that way. If you choose to go forward with creating these products under the hazard communication standard, you are still required to then create them according to the hazard communication standard. You cannot say, well, my product, it's really excluded under scope and application, so I'm going to have a label that only has half the required elements, or I'm going to have a safety data sheet that doesn't have all the required information because, I don't want to spend the next 3 weeks trying to figure it out, or whatever the case may be. It's a case of if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound. So again, I would strongly, and what we tell our clients is, verify whether or not you need to be going here. If you don't, then think very carefully about what you're doing before you decide to proceed. Because once you, put your foot in the pool, you've got to jump all the way in the pool. You cannot just stick into the D and go, well, that's all we're going to do. So, just be sure of what ground you're standing on and how you're going to commit to this before you go there.
That sounds great, Nikki. Thanks. In order to expand a little bit on everything that you were talking about, I have another question for you. If our product is boxed individually and then 12 to a larger box for sale, do the inside boxes and individual product containers within the 12 interior boxes both need GHS labels?
I'm sorry, if that was directed at me, we had a bit of a commotion here at our facility. Could you please restate the question?
Yes. If our product is boxed individually and then in a larger box for sale in a quantity of 12, do the inside boxes and individual product containers within the 12 interior boxes both need GHS labels?
The individual shipped containers need to have GHS labels, yes, absolutely. Each container must be properly labeled.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the next one. This one's for you, Steve. In section 3 of the screenshot that you had during your presentation, you discussed a little bit about ranges. Are ranges permitted on SDSs?
Yes, there's OSHA has a section that specifically refers to trade secrets, and if there's a couple of different situations in that section that I don't know off the top of my head exactly verbatim. But basically, if there's any trade secret claimed, or if there's any variability in the manufacturing process, you're allowed to put a range within the ingredient in section 3. And we've seen across the board pretty wide ranges, and no one's being questioned on that as far as I've heard. So I think that that's pretty. That one's pretty industry standard and based on the OSHA trade secret clause.
That sounds great. Here's another question for you, Steve. Can we get the GHS compliant SDS sheets without waiting for the vendors? If so, where can we get them?
For an individual product, I would say no. If you want to try and get them before the vendors, if you have all the information from their other sheet, you can try and engineer one yourself. But there really is no clearinghouse for manufacturers and SDSs. That's one of the biggest problems with the way this is being implemented. And I don't know if there was a way around it, but to do the proper job to create your SDS, one of the inputs is the raw material SDSs, and if you don't have those, then you're kind of it's kind of a chicken-egg situation. But there is no clearinghouse for that sort of thing.
Great, thanks. Steve, this is also for you. On the physical properties, are all 28 categories required to be listed, even if they're not applicable or information isn't available?
No, you just need to list the hazards for the given product. So if you've got something that's an eye irritant and a skin irritant and a toxin of some sort, that has to be listed. But if you don't need to say explosive no and flammable liquid no, so on and so forth. You just need to list detail the hazards that are applicable to your particular product.
Great, thank you. Is it true that if you want to protect your formulation, you must also register your formula as a trade secret? If you choose not to register a trade secret, can you still use the ranges? This one's for you, Steve.
The United States does not have any such registration. Now, in Europe, that is the case. If you're going to claim trade secret on an ingredient in Europe, you do need to register it, and I don't know the details for that off the top of my head, but in the United States, no.
Thanks. This one's for you, Nikki. What exactly needs to go on the label? All of Section 2, the pictogram, signal words, and the cautionary statement?
There are 6 required elements that have to go on a GHS-based HCS label. The 6 elements are the product identifier, which basically is, the name and identification of what the stuff is. Supplier information, which is name, address, and telephone number of the manufacturer of the product. And then the pictograms, which are applicable to the product. The signal word, which is going to be either danger or warning, depending on how the product is classified and assigned a severity of risk. And then hazard statements and precautionary statements.
Great, thank you. This one's for Steve. In our laboratories, we mix large amounts of buffer to be used in some of our processes. Most of them are not classified according to GHS. They are moved around within the building and sometimes may be stored up to a month. Do these buffers need labels and or SDSs? If some of them are classified, do they need labels and or SDSs?
Anything that is classified, it needs a label in the workplace. An internal SDS is probably a very good idea. I'm not entirely sure that it is mandatory as long as the hazards are disclosed on the label. But if it's a non-hazardous buffer, I'm not entirely sure you need to label it, but at best business practices, I would have everything labeled in a consistent manner.
Great.
As far as the SDS being required for an internal product, Nikki, do you know one way or the other on that?
I don't believe there's a requirement for internal products, but yeah, I would agree with you that as a best practice, if it's something that you routinely work with, it's not a bad idea to have it, certainly.
Thanks.
Thanks. This one's for you as well, Steve. I ship both hazardous and non-hazardous waste commingled. Am I affected by the GHS regulations? If yes, how?
The hazardous waste shipping is not is one of the exclusions, so it is not handled under GHS. That would still be handled under your hazardous waste manifest. So you do not need an SDS or GHS label for hazardous waste. That still falls under the hazardous waste manifesting regulations.
That sounds great. This is the one, Steve or Nikki, you can take this.
Toss up.
Yeah.
Buzz in first and you'll get the answer.
Are both SDS conversions and labels due by June 1st, 2015? Or is the label requirement later in 2015, like December 1st?
They are both, if you are manufacturing the product, they are both June 1st. The December deadline is for basically for warehouses. So if you're a supplier to a warehouse or if you're a supplier to an end user, your product needs to be labeled and you have to have the SDS by June 1st. If you are a distributor, you are allowed to have stock on your shelf that is labeled in the old format until December. Although, as I alluded to earlier, I think the gating factor there is going to be your customer demand. Come June 1st, I'm thinking you're going to be under an awful lot of pressure to supply the updated documentation.
Great. This one's for Nikki. Pictograms on the label need to be in color. Do they need to be on the SDS as well? I'm sorry, Steve, you can take this one.
They need the red border on the label. And the SDS, this has been questioned quite a few times in OSHA. I think the latest I've heard is that the SDS can be in black and white.
Great. This question is specific about quantum software. This is an authoring software that a lot of clients use in order to generate SDSs. Does the software take into account rules in the Purple Book, batching, dilutions, concentration cutoff? Also, how does the software classify material that is not already classified and no data is available?
Well, yes to the first question. The software is algorithm-based and takes into account all the rules of the Purple Book. Some of them are a little more ambiguous when it comes to the input data. There are chemicals out there that do not have a whole lot of data. The system ships with a large quantity of ingredient data, but there are things that you'll see from your manufacturer's SDSs, such as the proprietary surfactant blend that Jessica mentioned earlier. These can be added by the user into the software. As long as you have all of the information from the supplier, you're in good shape.
That sounds great. So, if a distributor has my product in stock after December 1st, is it their responsibility to make sure it's relabeled, or mine? This one's for you, Nikki.
Well, what the rule says is that the distributor may not ship it. So at that point, the distributor has basically two options. They could try to label it themselves, or they could simply ship it back to the manufacturer. Now, that's obviously subjective. It's going to be an individual choice. But I can tell you from a risk management perspective, if I'm a distributor, there's absolutely zero probability that I'm going to try to classify a product myself and send it out. I'm going to reject that and send it back to the manufacturer. Basically, the way the rule works is the requirement to classify and label continues downstream. So if the manufacturer doesn't do it, which they're supposed to, but let's say for the sake of argument that they don't, then the next set of hands downstream that has the product in them becomes responsible, and on and on and on until it gets down to an individual industry user. Now, of course, in real life, what's going to happen is, hopefully, people who get a package on their dock and look at it and it's not correct are going to reject it because, again, from a risk management perspective, it would not be terribly wise to take somebody else's product and try to classify it yourself when, as Steve alluded to earlier, you don't have all the necessary information and data available to make a correct classification. So in technical terms, theoretically, a distributor after December 1st could act themselves to classify and label a product. However, in practical terms, if they have any concept of liability and risk management principles, that is not going to happen. That product is either A, never going to leave the shelf, or more likely it's going to get sent back to the manufacturer or be rejected in the first place.
Great, thank you. This one's also for you, Nikki. Is there a minimum label size based on container size?
There is no current minimum size specified. What is specified is that the label has to be legible and readable. So, and that again is where we get into this whole situation with very small containers. When NIST talked to OSHA, they kind of tried to explain that. They said, look, OSHA, we've got a bunch of really tiny containers, and in order to make labels for them large enough for an average human being to be able to recognize and read, those labels are going to be way too big for the containers we have. What are we supposed to do? And then they went on to suggest 4 or 5 different possible solutions, most of which, and this is only my personal opinion, were very practical and very rational and very well thought out. However, OSHA rejected all of them. So right now, you're just kind of stuck. I mean, if you've got a very small container, you still have a responsibility to label it so that it's readable and legible. And I wish I could offer people relief from that, but unfortunately, as of right now, it's not the case.
Don't shoot the messenger.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Nikki and Steve. That's all we have time for today. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to email me at amanda@usequantum.com, and we'll be sure to answer it right away. For those of you that submitted questions during the webinar and we didn't have a chance to get to them, we will be responding to you directly within the next few hours. We're extremely grateful for the opportunity to share our regulation expertise with you. As a token of our appreciation, I'm happy to offer a sample MSDS to SDS conversion for only $135. Mention this webinar in your conversation with a Quantum Sales Associate, and they'll be able to complete your conversion in only 1 week. Again, thank you for your time. We hope you have a great day.